Hi, I'm Elissa Gershowitz, Editor-in-Chief of the Hornbook Inc., and coming to you from the offices of the Boston Globe. I'm very glad to be talking to Brandy Colbert, winner of the 2022 Boston Globe Hornbook Award for Nonfiction for Blackbirds in the Sky, the story and legacy of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Brandy is the author of the novels The Only Black Girls in Town, The Voting Booth, The Revolution of Bertie Randolph, Finding Yvonne, Little and Lion, and Point. She has contributed to YA anthologies, including Black Enough and Up All Night, and worked with acclaimed dancer Misty Copeland to adapt her memoir into a young reader's edition, Life in Motion, An Unlikely Ballerina. Her background is journalism, and she is on the faculty of Hamline University's MFA program in writing for children and young adults. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
We'd like to start out with a reading from Blackbirds in the Sky, if you'd like.
Yes, I would love to. I'm going to read from the paperback, which came out a couple of weeks ago, so that's available now. So I'm going to read from the foreword of the book. By the time I'd reached fourth grade, the lesson I dreaded most was our history unit on slavery. I attended a predominantly white school in a predominantly white Missouri town, and more often than not, I felt like I fit in well enough. Some people went out of their way to point out my differences, like my highly textured hair that would curl and thicken at the scalp when my chemical relaxer started to grow out, or they'd hold their arm up to mine when they'd gotten a particularly good tan, showing me that they were almost as dark as me. There were other microaggressions, of course, way too many to name here. It was Southwest Missouri, and it was the 1980s. Racial sensitivity wasn't high on most people's list of priorities. History class felt uninspired and repetitive for much of the year, but the few days we spent learning about Black Americans were excruciating. I was embarrassed when our teachers talked about the African people who'd been stolen from their continent and brought to the United States to be part of a chattel slavery system. I didn't like the way both the teachers and the textbooks talked about enslaved people as if they weren't actual human beings with hopes and dreams and emotions and profound mental strength. I also didn't like that heads automatically swiveled to find me to see how I was reacting to the lesson because I was one of the only Black people they'd ever met in their entire lives. And in retrospect, I hated that the room was uncomfortably silent during the lesson, that nobody asked why we never learned about anyone apart from basic biographies of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, that no actual countries in Africa were ever named, which is likely why so many Americans still think Africa is a country rather than a continent, and that the lesson never explicitly stated how much the violent genocidal foundation of this country shaped everything about how our nation operates today. Perhaps the most insulting part about the units covering centuries of Black history is that they were so brief. We spent maybe a week on the topic, if that. Reconstruction was never explained in a meaningful way. The civil rights lesson was, again, focused on sanitized versions of two people, Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I never came across the names of voting rights activists Fannie Lou Hamer or Stokely Carmichael or John Lewis in our textbooks. And I can't remember one mention of Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress, as well as the first woman and Black woman to run for a major political party's nomination for President of the United States. The fact that there was no separate detailed lesson about the Trail of Tears, which ran right through our hometown, was particularly egregious. I blame the history texts more than my individual teachers. For the most part, I know the curriculum was not up to them. And I know that some of them, all white women and men, were inherently uncomfortable teaching lessons about such traumatic times in our country's history. But all these years later, after meeting so many dedicated, progressive, and passionate educators around the country, I have to wonder, why didn't just one of my teachers care enough to go off script, to sit in their discomfort so we could have honest conversations about our past, to not only challenge us to learn more, but to challenge themselves as well?
Thank you. So, as I have told you, I am someone who dog ears pages, and I have a lot of things that that I want to ask and talk about, and I'm going to try to stay on track. But there's so much to get into with this book. So, first, can you briefly describe what happened in Tulsa and specifically Greenwood? on June 1st, 1921, for those who don't know. And later on, I want to get to the issue of why people might not know. But for people who don't know, what is this book describing? What is it about?
Right. So on that evening, or the evening before, actually, a young Black man named Dick Rowland was arrested for allegedly trying to sexually assault a young woman named Sarah Page, who was he was a young Black man, and she was a young white elevator operator in the building where he worked. And, I believe the wording was a little vague, but it was basically, at the time, it was meant as rape allegations. So taken very seriously. He was arrested. He was taken to the top of the Tulsa, their county courthouse, and he was put at the top because they had special jail cells back then, because white mobs would often come and, take the incarcerated person down and, kind of vigilante justice. And so a group of, the news quickly spread to the Black community, which was North Tulsa, the Greenwood district, where the majority of the Black people lived in Tulsa. It was quite segregated at the time, and they heard that he was being held in the jail. So a group of Black men came down to just kind of ask what was going on, to try to keep the peace, because they heard a white mob had begun assembling outside of the courthouse. And the mob started to grow. The Black men kind of were told to go home, to keep the peace, but they came back because they heard the mob was growing outside of the courthouse. They came back armed. People from the mob saw the guns. They went to get their guns. It turned into the standoff. A shot rang out. No one's quite sure, who the shot came from. And then really just chaos ensued. The mob marched across the train tracks that separated the two neighborhoods and essentially began razing the entire Greenwood district. They burned hundreds of homes. They murdered a lot of people. And then the people they didn't murder, they would march down to these sort of internment camps they had made. And these were just people who were living their lives, some who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yeah, at the end of it, the Greenwood district was essentially gone.
And you touch on this at the beginning of the book, but how much did you know going in? How did you learn about this? And what made you want to write about it?
Yeah, so I think I definitely did not learn about the Tulsa Race Massacre until I was an adult. I would say it was probably in my 30s. I mean, it had to have been, probably at least 5 to 10 years ago. I just kind of heard about it in passing, but then I noticed people started talking about it more in the last few years, particularly when the HBO show Watchmen premiered in the fall of 2019, about 3 years ago, I think. And I'm not a super big, superhero person. I wasn't aware of the story of Watchmen, anything about it, but I loved, the actors in it, and it sounded interesting. And then when I saw the opening scene that depicted, sort of a retelling of the Tulsa Race Massacre, I knew it was real. And I was like, oh, wow, they're really going there. And then, the show was great. And I started hearing a lot of people say that they had not heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre before. And they were wondering, they first heard about it in that show. And they were like, is that actually a real thing that happened? Mm-hmm. And so that sparked a lot of conversation. People started discussing it more. And I was talking to my editor, Jordan Brown at HarperCollins, and he was like, we were talking about it. And I'm like, I don't think that there's really any books out there for teens about this, teens and kids to learn about this at the time, no nonfiction accounts. And so it's like, should I try it? And he was very supportive. It was my first nonfiction book. It was very overwhelming, but it was so rewarding to not only learn more about the history of Black Americans, the history of this event that happened just 3 hours from where I grew up, but to also to be able to share that information with kids so they're more informed than I was at that age.
Mm. And I'm thinking too of last year, the beautiful picture book by Carol Boston Weatherford and the late Floyd Cooper, Unspeakable, which is about this topic, but it's a very different approach. It's a picture book. It's shorter. It's sort of a snapshot, and it won a lot of awards.
Yes, it did.
So it really, last year, I'm sort of jumping ahead in my questions, but I'll just start here. So last year, 2021 was the 100th anniversary. And like you say, there was a lot of discussion relative to just maybe before about this. particular event, which is one of many events. And it just seems, it's so easy to either not know or to look away, to willfully not see. The anniversary brought these, shown a light on the events in a certain way, but what's the bigger mission? How do we get more people to know about these events and other events in our history that people either don't know about or don't want to see or discuss?
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult balance, even putting sort of the new crusade for book banning aside, which is a different conversation, because there are certainly people who don't want, children, especially, and teenagers to learn about this from a young age. And that was sort of the case that happened with the Tulsa Race Massacre. Documents were destroyed. People did not talk about it. They did not recount it in any sort of commemorations of Tulsa. But for me, I think it's really about making the history accessible. So like you mentioned, Unspeakable, it is a really beautiful picture book. It was really interesting because, of course, Carol Boston Weatherford, the author, and I did all the same research. So it was like being able to read my book just in a different form, and just told in this beautiful poetic way that she has. But I think making it accessible for people is so important. So that's an accessible way. I think adults should still be reading picture books. So if someone maybe doesn't want to dive really far into it with, a longer account like mine, that's a way to start. But I think that if you look at that picture book, you're going to have questions, wanting to dig more into it. And so the reason I sort of wanted to write my book in a way that didn't feel like, a textbook, that felt like I was talking to the reader, like we're sort of working this out ourselves, but to provide a lot of context, I think, is so important for history books also, because I felt like when I was growing up, I was just reading all these dates and these names of these people who no longer existed. And I'm like, what is this even about? Why are we talking about this? And I just feel like it's so important to give that context. And that was what I really tried to do with this book. Yes, here's what happened over those 18 hours. And, we know it's because Dick Rowland was arrested and what he was arrested for. But really, here's, where the United States kind of started. Here's how, the Greenwood District started. Here's what Tulsa looked like at the time. Here's what, the larger United States, what its relationship with Black Americans looked like at the time. So I really think just being able to write about all of that stuff and explain it in a way that I hope is interesting, can really help teens become interested in history when it feels like, okay, they can start drawing some of the parallels from the past to what's happening today, which is certainly evident when I was writing and researching this book.
Yeah, that brings up a few questions, but I guess I'll start with it. Well, I think you probably answered this, but so is that why you chose the structure of the book? The structure is, it's unique for a nonfiction book. You start sort of today with your voice as you read, and then you lay out the introduction to the events of the book, and then you back way up in history. And we stay in that back way up time for a good long while before we get back to the main events. Was that what your intention was, as to put the structure together like that?
Yeah, definitely. That was one thing that was, really great working with my editor. We were sort of able to break down what would be the best way to tell that. And, I think I probably had it structured a little bit differently at first. I knew I wanted all of that information in, but working with him on edits was really great because I was able to see breaking it up in the way that I did, I think also maybe helps the reader process things a little easier, because you just have this big chunk of all of these really horrible things happened, over these couple of days. That can be really tough to process. I think it's tough enough to process as written. So I think, kind of like you said, backing up and giving some of the context behind it. And I think there's this one part of your brain that's making sense of what's going on, and you're starting to get sort of immersed in this American history. And then this other part knows that more about the massacre is coming up, and hopefully the two parts sort of come together to really make sense then, when you're reading the book.
Well, and it's not a giant book. I mean, it's 200-ish pages. But you learn so much. I mean, there's so much in here. And so how, not to say how did you do your research, but how on earth did you figure out how to distill it into this
Yeah,
size?
it's always funny when I saw this book, when I got the, final version, I was like, oh, it's a cute little thing, it was like, oh, it's, beautifully packaged, but like, just all the work I'd done, I was like, oh, okay. You kind of expected it to just be like 500 pages. I knew it would be shorter, but yeah, that was another thing. While I was doing research, I was just thinking, gosh, like, there's so much I wanted to write about. There's so many things, like the Oklahoma chapter in particular, which is one of the first chapters, was just so unwieldy because I just had the best time researching Oklahoma, which sounds a little strange because it actually has very fraught history. But it was just always sort of the sleepy state that was, I lived 2 hours from the border, and then getting into the research, I was like, oh my goodness, like I want to read like whole books about Oklahoma. So I think initially, it was gathering all the information that I thought was relevant, and then kind of moving back from that, we decided that it didn't really make sense for the book to kind of cover anything that happened after the massacre that wasn't directly related to it. So there was all this history that I wanted to talk about, but essentially tried to keep it from, probably like I would say the 1700s is where I kind of started writing about things, sometimes 1600s, up through 1921. So that helps. But there was so much more. Probably if I had been left to my own devices, it would be like a 500-page book. So everyone should be grateful to my editor.
The director's cut coming soon.
Yes.
Well, and you touched on this, but writing the book, when you were writing it, how was that for you?
Oh, that was 2020. So starting out at the beginning of the year, I just thought, oh, this is going to be great. I can go to Tulsa. I haven't been in many years. Instead, I spent the entire year in my apartment, watching, the world seem to just set itself on fire. It was tough, the subject matter itself, of course, is difficult, just immersing yourself in that day after day. There were some days, of course, that I just really just didn't want to touch it, but you had to. And then the time that it was happening in 2020 was such a tumultuous year in many aspects. It just felt like every day turning on the news, there was something new. But it also, as depressing as that was at times, it also really like invigorated me. And I just felt like, okay, there's really not much I can do. There's this deadly global virus. Like I'm stuck at home. All this stuff is going on. And it felt like, okay, I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to do. Like I'm here, I'm seeing these, again, like I mentioned earlier, these parallels between the past and the present. I'm seeing this actually like, to the fact of like, I talk about Andrew Johnson, who was impeached twice. And, then we're talking about like the impeachment of our president then. And so it was really helpful looking back on it. It was hard to be in it, but I honestly think it was probably the best time for me to write it.
So I'm at, as I said, the Boston Globe office, and you have a journalism background, and there's a lot of journalism in this book, sort of for better or worse. And just thinking about the state of journalism today and shrinking local journalism, was that something you thought about in the context of your work or in general?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think about journalism a lot. So I graduated with a journalism degree 20 years ago. And I remember at the time they were kind of like, oh, there's not really going to be any jobs. And I was like, gosh, okay. Like, and then thinking after I graduated, like, oh my gosh, like I feel sorry for anyone who's getting a journalism degree, like even people who graduated like 3 or 4 years after me, because I just, we were moving onto the internet. Everything was like kind of blogging and, kind of hadn't, I think like the media industry kind of hadn't like gotten its legs yet on like the digital front. And so it just really seemed pretty dire. But now I'm like, no, like, there's so much going on in the world. I feel like journalism kind of is having its, I don't know, like journalism has always been important, has always been vital, but it does feel like it's sort of in a fresh wave, maybe of people being interested, people really looking to it in a way that they hadn't, since the internet sort of became king of media. So yeah, I I don't know, it was really interesting to go back, and especially the media chapter that I wrote was one of my favorites to write, just like the history of newspapers, in, you know, Oklahoma and Tulsa. But it was interesting again to see like the past, how important it was, how it felt like, you know, then people kind of moved away from newspapers, and how we're back in this spot where I think journalism is super important, and a lot of people are seeing that it really is like just, you know, has the power and ability to like change a lot of things.
So I'm going to quote you, and it's a question that you ask in the book, and maybe there isn't an answer. I'll ask you if you have an answer, but maybe it's just enough to leave it with the question. To quote you, one question I keep coming back to as I think about these two deadly pandemics, the 1918 influenza pandemic and COVID-19, question is history bound to repeat itself no matter what? Or does it repeat itself because so many people don't want to look to the past to see how we got to the future? Now, have you landed on an answer? Does it depend on the day? I mean, this is the question, and this will stay with me for sure.
Yeah, I think it does just kind of depend on the day. Like some days I feel really good about where we are, again, like feeling like people are really like, you know, reading the paper, they're getting different perspectives. They're not honed in on this one news source or whatever. They're reading history books, they're asking questions, they're, you know, doing their own research, they're engaged. And then there's other days where it just feels like, oh, everybody wants to ban books. Nobody wants to talk about the past, even if they don't want to ban the book. Maybe they want to censor it, or, you know, only give it to certain people, or don't want to make certain people feel bad about themselves. And it's disheartening, you know, that second part, when you see that happening and you hear about that happening, and, you know, I've experienced soft censorship, book banning, all of that. It's really upsetting, you know, because just, I don't think telling the truth should be anything that we should ever try to ban or censor. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, I guess it's like glass half full, glass half empty. Some days I feel really like optimistic. Like I think that we can move forward, and that people will really, you know, dig into history and help kind of engender change. Other days, not so much. But I think I have to lean on the side of hope. Maybe that's because I'm a YA author. Our books always sort of end with, you know, some kind of hope. But I just think it's sort of necessary to make it through tough times like we're all living in right now.
Well, thank you so much. Again, I could talk to you for another hour and a half, but maybe some other time.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.